Hi everybody, welcome to my video for chapter 10. In this video, we are going to talk about interviewing and interrogation techniques. So getting a witness to admit guilt is important to successful resolution in a case. So in order, sometimes the evidence isn't very strong, so we need to get people to admit their guilt, because this is going to leave very little room for reasonable doubt. So this is where the idea of interrogation and interviewing skills comes into play. So what's the difference between interviewing and interrogation? So an interview is asking systematic questions in order to get information about events or people that can help with your investigation. Typically in interviewing, the people we are talking to are not our targets in the case, but they may eventually become targets throughout the investigation. But in the beginning, they're not our targets. Interrogation, on the other hand, is where we have the targeted person and we are trying to solicit their confession to the fraud. All right, so when we are in a fraud examination, evidence is generally gathered in a manner that moves from the most general to the specific. So if we look at this bullseye, let me zoom in here. So if we look at this little bullseye, on the outside, we're going to start with some document analysis to get a general understanding of what's going on. And then we look at neutral third parties, people who might have some information, but they might have some knowledge about the suspect or fraud, but they're not really involved in the offense. Then we go to corroborative witnesses, co-conspirators, and then finally the target. So if after interviewing those neutral third-party witnesses, then we would move into those corroborative witnesses if it appears that further investigation is needed. The fraud examiner would proceed by interviewing the co-conspirators. We're generally going to interview these people in order. And only after those suspected co-conspirators have been interviewed is our actual target going to be confronted. By arranging the interview in this order, we are able to get as much information as possible before we actually interview the person, our prime target, and move into more of an admission-seeking interview or interrogation instead of just the regular interview. So that's our typical fraud. Like if you think someone stole money or something, that's the pattern we would take. However, if we are in a situation where we might have some fraudulent financial statements or fraudulent tax returns, we're going to actually go in the opposite order. So we would actually start with our target. The logic of this is pretty simple. So if we assume that someone knowingly created false financial statements or tax returns, the act of preparing that falsified document is part of the concealment of the act. So because of that, the perpetrator has made maybe an assumption that the auditor or the investigator wouldn't find out about the issue, or that it wouldn't be identified, that we aren't smart enough to know what they did. So essentially, they're betting that they're smarter than we are, and that they're going to get away with it. So by interviewing that person at the beginning, you're able to document their claim that the financial statements are not materially misstated, or that the tax returns are fine. And then as we subsequently find out about that fraudulent reporting, you've now caught that person in a lie, as they're trying to conceal that act. So the overview for interviewing and interrogation process. So there's some general steps that we should take. So when we are preparing and planning, that's like the key to your success. So it's the most critical point is in that preparation and planning. So we want to make sure we know as much as possible about the person that we're interviewing, what we think happened, the victim, the organization, everything we can. So this is going to help us to identify what needs to be uncovered in an interview, as well to help us detect clues to what might be deception, what seems like an unreasonable or inappropriate explanation for an event. So another thing to think about in the planning is where we want the interview to take place. Typically, we want the location to be free of distractions and interruptions. So we want to consider where we're going to have it, and we want to make sure we leave enough time to be able to fully get everything in the interview. So those are some other things to think about in planning. When we think about the general approach of conducting the interview, the interviewer should be able to see the entire body. So if they're fidgeting and moving their feet, but you can't see that, that's a cue that you're going to miss. So your chair should be at least 6 feet away, again, so that you can take in the whole picture of what's going on. You want to make sure you're respectful and professional at all times. They might get really mad and belligerent, but you need to, remain calm and professional throughout. You want to avoid confusing language, keep the questions short and to the point. Don't take a whole lot of notes, and make sure you're watching that body language. So when we're interviewing witnesses, we want to remember, especially witnesses that are not the target of the investigation, we want to make sure we're keeping those people calm and talking. So we need to let the person know that that our assumption is based on the evidence collected at this time. They're not a key person that we're examining, keep them at ease, but also we have to let them know that it's possible that if things go in another direction, they could become the subject of our investigation. So some things to cover would be starting with our background information, asking our questions in a chronological order, asking about their connection with our primary suspects, thinking about any discussions that they might have had with those subjects, thinking about what information they might have, asking maybe about their opinions on why certain events might have happened or the acts that are under investigation, what they might know about it. And just kind of ask if they have any other helpful ideas that they think we should look into. So when we are interviewing, we're going to have a 3-step process of introduction, and then the body and the close. If we're doing an interrogation, remember the difference between those two is whether we are just trying to get some information or whether we're trying to get an admission. So are we talking about the target or somebody else? So when we're doing an interrogation, we're just going to have the introduction and the admission seeking phase. So of an interview, we're going to want to start with a very professional, non-confrontational tone. We're going to greet the person, tell them what we're doing, just kind of set that overall tone, establish the rapport, get the person ready to cooperate with us, and just kind of set the baseline for the rest of the interview. And then in the body of our interview, this is where the facts and evidence of the case are going to be reviewed. We're going to ask general, open-ended questions. We're going to allow the interviewee to complete answering those questions. We're going to try and understand each question and answer before we move on to make sure that we've fully understood exactly what they're trying to tell us. We want to be patient. We don't want to interrupt. We want to be good listeners. We're trying to gather, that information. And we also want to watch for signs or cues that they might be trying to misdirect us or deceive us in one way or another. And then in the end, after we've gotten all the information that we need in that body period, we're going to move into the close. Here, we're just going to review and summarize those important aspects of the interview, make sure that we understood everything the way that they understood it, ask any clarification or classifying questions, to try and, again, make sure we are fully understanding what they're telling us. And on a positive note, give them your card, leave the door open in case they have anything else that they want to share with us. Now, when we are doing the interrogation, the introduction, these again are the interrogations are for when we are trying to get confessions from the people we think are guilty of the act that we're examining. So the introduction is probably going to be fairly similar, but the process seeks to kind of soften that target's resistance to confessing by identifying a rationalization that is palpable to them. So, maybe providing that moral justification or the reason for those targets' actions in order to get them to come forward and confess on those acts. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail here in a bit. So as we are going through interviews and interrogations, there's 5 different types of questions that we can ask. So the first one is introductory. So introductory questions are just there to provide information and establish rapport, kind of set the tone, establish a theme, and also observe the person's reaction, just so we can kind of understand how the person acts. Typically, we don't want these. We don't want to interview more than one person at a time. So we want to have one-on-one conversations. We want these interviews to be held in like out of earshot and out of sight from others. So, they have a sense of privacy. In the introductory phase, or with the introductory questions, we're going to ask non-sensitive questions. Again, these are questions just to build that rapport. We want to get a commitment in the introductory questions for assistance. So we want to encourage the interview to voice a positive yes, that they're willing to help, and not just like a shaking of their head or remaining silent. We want them to voice in the with these introductory questions that they're willing to help. After we've kind of gotten that willingness to help, we can transition into some of the informational or assessment questions. We want to make sure we're not promising confidentiality. The information is going to be shared with others, but only on kind of a need-to-know basis. In the informational questions here, we're actually gathering facts from the interviewee. We can ask either open-ended questions, closed-ended questions, leading questions, just again to try and get that information. We want the questions sequence to proceed from general questions to more specific. So just kind of lay the framework first and then get more specific details. So we're going to begin with background questions. We want to observe their verbal and nonverbal behavior. We might, focus more on the open-ended questions. We want to approach sensitive questions carefully. And people may be difficult to deal with. So how do we deal with some difficult people? So we need to be sure we don't react. If someone is getting really angry, it's our job to kind of remain calm and ensure that we don't react to anger with hostility. We shouldn't strike back or give in or terminate the interview. We just need to kind of remain calm and go through the motions. A common mistake is that we try to reason with an unreceptive person. So instead of doing that, the interviewer should attempt to kind of disarm them. And the best tactic is surprise. So if the person is like stonewalling you, he or she accepts the interviewer, expects them to apply some pressure or attack, then we kind of do the opposite. And it maybe acknowledge the point and agree whenever we can. Also, we might need to change tactics. So in some situations, changing tactics helps to reduce that hostility. And that means maybe casting what the person says in a form of direct. Sorry. All right, where was I? So then we can move into our closing questions. So at the end, after we've gathered all the information, then we're just going to kind of reconfirm the facts, go over some of the key details to make sure we correctly understood everything. But we're not going to go over every single detail, just kind of high level, the basics of the facts. At this point, we might need to gather some additional facts, again, kind of leaving the door open. We want to ask them if they feel like they've been treated fairly, giving them a final chance to add anything and leaving the door open. The fourth type of question is called the assessment question. So these are used when like previous statements might be kind of inconsistent or possibly deceptive. So here we use something called norming or calibrating, and that's the process of observing behavior before asking a critical question to see how that person is going to react. So assessment questions ask the interviewee to agree with something that most honest people would not agree with. So a dishonest person would agree with the statement, and an honest person wouldn't agree with that statement. So we can assess the reaction to these questions to establish the credibility of that person based on their response to these questions. When we're asking these assessment questions, we want to start with the most basic, kind of least sensitive, and then kind of work our way up into those sensitive questions. And again, kind of just to see their reaction before we move into some of those other questions. And then finally, we have admission seeking. So these are going to be used in interrogations of people that we believe are guilty of the fraud. And the suspect has, been the target of our investigation. So these questions should be asked in a particular order to clear an innocent person or encourage a guilty person to confess. So the purpose of these admission seeking is, again, to distinguish innocent from guilty, obtain a confession, and then obtain a written confession acknowledging those facts. So that's the purpose of these admission seeking questions. So some other things to consider are the presence of outsiders. So it is usually not necessary to inform the person like with their Miranda rights. They're not necessarily entitled to have an attorney present. But if they do, those representatives should not be asking questions or objecting to what we have. The interviewer should try to convince the respondent that confession is in their best interest, offer an acceptable reason for that behavior. Right there. So the interviewer wants to show sympathy, minimize the perception that we think what they did was wrong, never show disgust or outrage for what happened. The subject's guilt should already be assumed in the form of a question. So we want to be careful about accusing an innocent person of a crime, because that could maybe cause some legal liability to the interviewer or the company. So again, when we are doing these interrogations and trying to get someone to admit their guilt, there's a specific step or series of events that we want to take. So we want to start by actually accusing the subject of committing their offense. So we want to put this in the form of a statement. Avoid using words like steal or fraud or crime, but just phrase it as though the person's guilt has already been established. Then we want to observe their reaction. So a guilty person is going to react with silence or a weak denial, but it's uncommon for a guilty person to outright deny the accusation. The innocent person will usually react with shock and anger at being accused and strongly deny carrying out the act in question. So then after we've we've accused them, watched their reaction, then we're going to repeat that accusation. And if the accused does not strenuously object after the accusation is made, it should be repeated with the same degree of conviction and strength. We want to interrupt denials. So both the truthful and untruthful person will normally object to the accusation and attempt to deny it. But a guilty person, more than an innocent one, is likely to stop short of an outright denial. And they're more likely to furnish you with explanations as to why he or she is not the responsible party. It's important in these instances where the convicted person, where they're denying their responsibility, that we interrupt those denials, because then when they ultimately confess, they're also now lying when they're providing their denial. So we don't want them to have to, say, yeah, I did this fraud and I just lied to you. So we want to kind of interrupt those denials so that they don't also have to, admit to lying to you just a few minutes ago. So it actually is going to make it easier for them to confess if you interrupt those denials and don't let them provide you with their justification. So then after we have interrupted the denials, then we can establish rationalization. So assuming that the subject does not confess, you should provide some sort of rationalization to explain away those moral consequences of the action. So we've talked about the fraud triangle, so we know what some of these rationalizations should be, but you should appear compassionate and understanding. And some of the rationalizations you could offer, like unfair treatment, inadequate recognition, financial problems, stress, drugs, alcohol, revenge, depersonalizing the victim, whatever their need might be. So just kind of saying, I understand, I've got a kid in college too. And, again, explaining away that moral consequence to get them a little bit more comfortable and be like, yeah, of course, that's why I did this. We also want to diffuse any alibis. So to combat any excuse the person is giving you, so if they say, I couldn't do it because I was X, Y, or Z, or I didn't have this, that, or the other thing. So we want to diffuse those alibis so they can't use those defenses. So sometimes this would include showing them our physical evidence, discussing the witnesses that we have talked about, discussing any deception that we might know about. So the purpose here is to appeal to their logic and not to necessarily scold or degrade them. We want to make sure we don't tell them that they're lying, present them with some alternatives. So when the person is on the verge of confessing, you can present them with two alternatives. So one is, so for example, did you plan this deliberately or did it just happen? So you're assuming that they're guilty and you're just wondering why that happened. So we're presenting them with these alternatives, and whether they answer yes or no to, did you plan to do this or did it just happen? They're basically acknowledging their guilt. So so that's where we're moving into kind of obtaining that baseline benchmark. So whether they have, when you're presenting those alternatives, any way they answer those, they are making that benchmark admission. So they're not fully admitting what happened, but they're confessing kind of subconsciously about what happened in that benchmark confession. And then after we've gotten that benchmark confession, when you say, something like, did you just want extra money or did you do it because you had financial problems? And you might say, well, my mom, was in the hospital with cancer. So when you say that, you're not directly admitting your guilt, but you're kind of admitting your guilt because you're admitting that you had those financial problems that led you to steal the money. So after you've got that benchmark confession, then you transition into the verbal confession, where you're trying to kind of get the final details about the offense, figuring out, probing for some additional details, and finding out, fleshing out that confession. So some things that we would like to know in that verbal confession, that the accused knew what they were doing was wrong, some facts that they would be the only ones that know about. So getting, again, some additional details about the fraud that you might not know about, how many times it had happened, why it happened, when it started, when it ended, if there were any other people involved, what happened, the specifics of all those offenses. Those are some of the things we're trying to find in that verbal confession. After we have a verbal confession, then we're going to want to get a signed confession, because it is much more difficult to change your response when there's a document in writing that has your why, has the whys right there. So some things we are trying to get them to confess to is their intent. So was it an accident or a fraud? So we want to prove intent, that they knew what they were doing was wrong. So we want to get that intent down. We want them to tell us that it was a voluntary confession and was not coerced. When it happened, how much, how many times, that they are willing to cooperate. So these are just some of the things that we're trying to get into that written statement. And then last, judging deception. So it's very difficult to tell when someone is lying to you. But I'm going to talk a little bit here about how you can judge deception. So the first item here is the physiology of deception. So lying is going to produce stress on the body, and your body is going to try and relieve that stress. So there can be some verbal and nonverbal cues that we can pick up on how the body is relieving that stress. So this could be things that the interviewer can use based on the behavior, the physical environment that we have. Personal biases can play into this as well. So that's just kind of some of the basics. So what are some of the verbal cues to deception? So we could have change in speech patterns. So maybe someone usually has a really laid back style of speech, and now they're really kind of prim and proper. They can repeat their question to you. So you ask a question and then they repeat the question before they actually answer it. They could have maybe selective memory. So they can remember every baseball score that happened, but they can't remember what happened last week when they were making their deposit. They could be making excuses. They could be saying things like, I swear on my mother's grave that it happened, or just ask my wife, that character testimony, I'm great. They can answer a question with a question. They can be overly respectful. So yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. Those are some things that they can do. They'll have increasingly weaker denials. So they'll start with maybe a weak denial, and then it will get weaker as the interview progresses. Some nonverbal cues we could have, a lot of body motion. So your body is when you're lying, that creates stress. So how does your body deal with that? It might be that your body is fidgety. You're just moving, increased heart rate, sweating, talking with your hands, putting your hands over your mouth, just having a lot of energy, a nervous energy. You could be sitting in kind of like the fight or flight. So you're kind of in like a fleeing position, position toward the door, like you could want to run away. Crossing your arms, a fake smile. So these are some nonverbal cues that we can see. So the ability to judge deception, again, it's very difficult to catch someone in a lie. And some reasons that we fail to catch people in a lie is people have a tendency to believe other people. So we don't want to think people are lying to us. We can inaccurately judge their behaviors, fail to recognize some of those cues that we might see. People might just be able to manipulate, and they know these cues too. They sat through a class just like this and know that they need to calm their nervous energy, and this is caused by stress. So maybe you're interviewing a innocent person, but the interview itself is causing stress. So they might have these same stressful cues, even if, they didn't do anything. So that's, another reason why it might be difficult to judge an innocent person from a guilty person. So that's all I've got for us today. Tune in for our chapter 11 video. Have a great afternoon.